And then
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Bookseller Book Chat. Thank you all so much for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, as I often am these days, with my good friend and colleague, Davith Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. Before we get started, a couple of quick notes. First of all, you probably noticed as you were coming in that this evening's presentation is being recorded. It will be up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. However, fear not, only those of us who are unmuted and speaking will appear in that recording, so you can have your video on and you will not be recorded for posterity. In light of that, please use the chat throughout the evening for any questions or notes that you might have. And then last of all, before we get started, a word of thanks and to all of you. Independent bookselling is not the world's easiest business, even in good times. And the last few years have been particularly rough for all sorts of small businesses and independent businesses. And all of us at both Northshire locations are very aware that we wouldn't still be here without the incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. We are incredibly grateful for that support, and thank you for continuing it on into the future. So those are my notes. Davith is now going to introduce our bookseller guest this evening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Well, first off, we've got a list of all of tonight's books that are being recommended. You can find it on the Notes from the Shire blog on our website. You can find it also, I'm putting the link in the chat right here. You can find it by going to northshire.com and on the menu, click Notes from the Shire. And the first link there will be to this blog post, which has everything that's being recommended tonight. So first up, we have master bookseller Alden Graves from our Northshire's Manchester location. Alden, why don't you tell us about the books you've selected for the night?
okay. I've been accused a number of times here at the Northshire of giving away too much when I'm talking about books. And I'm going to have to be especially careful because the first book I'm going to talk about this evening is a mystery. I don't really read very many mysteries, but I like John Banville very much. He's a wonderful writer. And I very much admired his book, Snow, which was an Agatha Christie-ish type of mystery set in a dilapidated estate in Ireland with an extremely eccentric family and a dead priest in the library. I enjoyed it very much. It was a lot of fun. His new book is just as much fun. It's called April in Spain. And this features a recurring character in Banville's books by the name of Garrett Cork, who I understand now, I have never read his crime series when he was using the name Benjamin Black, but Cork is a recurring character in those that crime series that he wrote earlier. Cork is a very irritable, alcoholic Dublin pathologist who complains as much as he drinks. And he is on a holiday in Spain with his wife, who is the most patient woman in the world, trying very hard not to enjoy himself. And he happens to notice a woman one day who was a close friend of his daughter's. And the reason she makes an impression upon him is that April Latimer, the woman's name, was supposedly murdered by her brother years and years and years ago. The brother concealed his sister's body and then drove his car over a cliff and killed himself. And this potential scandal threatened to derail the political career of their very powerful uncle. And Quirk decides to invite his daughter over to Spain to try to discreetly look at this woman who now goes by the name of Angela Lawless. You'll note the initials are the same, to see if she is really her long lost friend. But there are people who are equally determined to keep April Latimer dead, one way or the other. And these people are not people you fool around with. It's a really delightful mystery. It's a little bit complex, but in a good way. And I think I really liked it because the crotchety Dr. Quirk, I probably recognize a lot of myself in him. The second book I want to talk about is my favorite book this year. I have a terrible time centering things. This is Bewilderment by Richard Powers, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning The Overstory. I say it's my favorite book this year. It's not an easy book to explain. It's a very difficult book to explain. Take my word for it. A lot of the initial part of the novel is it's kind of setting up what comes after, but the expository stuff at the beginning, believe me, what comes after is worth kind of going through this setup. It is about a 9-year-old child who has recently lost his beloved mother, who was very involved in environmental causes, and the child has picked up on her enthusiasm for trying to undo the harm that we are doing to this planet now. And he is apt to, he's subject to these fits of fury when he's virtually uncontrollable. And in desperation, his father decides to let him participate in a scientific program that subjects the boy to the brainwave patterns of other people who don't have his difficulties, including, with quite serious ramifications, the brain patterns of his mother. I'm going to read you my last sentence of the review I wrote for the book. It sounds a little stilted if I pretend it's impromptu. I wrote one of the most involving, thought-provoking, and ultimately moving books that I've read in a very long time. Its implications will resonate with readers long after the last page is read. I really recommend this. It's a wonderful book. My next book is by a woman who lives in Vermont. Her name is Brett Ann Stanshew, and the book is called Unstitched. And I don't know what drew me to this book, maybe the kind of pastoral cover. She's a librarian in a small town in Vermont. And the library where she worked was regularly being broken into at night. And being a small town, most everybody had a good idea as to who was breaking into the library. The person was not doing any damage other than breaking into the building. But obviously she was very concerned about the break-ins. And before the man who they all assumed was committing these crimes was brought to justice, he committed suicide. And Ms. Stanshew sort of underwent these deep emotional guilt feelings, thinking that she should have handled the whole situation much better than she did. The man who had broken into the library was a longtime drug addict. And this book in general, yeah, I'm going to read you the last sentence I wrote on my review of this too. This is a dark side of the Green Mountain State, where the profusion of drugs casts a long, tragic shadow over bucolic settings of pristine snowfalls and bright autumn leaves. It's a side of Vermont that doesn't get very much attention, but it really is an example of how deadly serious the drug problem is in the state of Vermont. My next book is one that I picked up because I was in one of my valleys where I couldn't find anything I really wanted to read. And I think A Passage North, I think it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, I'm not sure. It is by an author by the name of Anouk Andropagazm. And I generally try to avoid books with authors whose name I probably can't pronounce, but this book was just wonderful. It's about a young man in Sri Lanka, which has been just decimated by 30 years of civil war. And the boy's grandmother, who was a difficult woman, they have hired a caretaker for her who becomes very close to the grandmother, her confidant, the only person she really confides in and trusts. And eventually the woman who's the confidant, the grandmother, goes home to visit her family in the northern part of the country, and she dies up there. And this young man, the book mostly is the young man's reflections about his life on the train ride from where he lives to where the caretaker lives in the northern part of Sri Lanka. He is not a political animal, although the woman he was in a relationship with was very political, very much on the side of the freedom fighters in the country. And the relationship finally dissolved because of the differences. The reason I this book made a very deep impression on me because of the caretaker. The caretaker was a woman who had lost both of her sons in the Civil War. And whereas in most novels, you are aware of a journey from a point to another point, and it can be forward or backwards, but it is a journey. But this woman, the caretaker, was a woman who could not get beyond what had happened to her. As much as she tried, she could not get beyond the death of her second son. And I don't know why that was such a revelation to me, that sometimes people just can't get beyond a certain point in their lives. But it was in this book. And I was so glad that I read it. My next book is about the worst wildfire in California history. In November, I think it was I think it was 1987. I'm not sure about that. The author of this is named Lizzie Johnson. A dilapidated power pole with an electrical cord that was just dangling finally broke loose and started a fire in tinder dry terrain in Northern California. And the fire, it roared like a runaway train toward the towns in the nearby area. And especially impacted was a town called Paradise. By the time the fire had finally been put out, 90% of Paradise was gone. And 89 people had been incinerated in the fire. And this is as much about, it's a meticulous recreation of the fire itself, but it's also an accusatory a book about the carelessness of corporate America. And God knows if anybody deserves attention, it's corporate America for their carelessness. Pacific Gas and Electric has had a horrible track record for this sort of thing happening. It happens all the time. They get out of any kind of payments by declaring bankruptcy afterwards, and thereby avoiding all the lawsuits that have been found against them. Elizabeth Warren once said that until the boards of directors and the CEOs are held criminally responsible for things like the Paradise Fire, this is going to go on happening. And my last book is also about corporate malfeasance, and it is called Titanic: Why She Collided, Why She Sank, and Why She Should Never Have Sailed. And this is a book for people who think they know everything about the Titanic, like I did. But I think most people don't realize that both technically and literally, the Titanic was a ship that was on fire. They knew it when it left Southampton, and it never should have been allowed to sail. But there was a fire in one of the 3-story high coal bunkers in the ship. And a fire sounds like it might be an easy thing to put out in a confined space like a coal bunker, but it's very, very difficult to put out. And the only way they could do it was by emptying this 3-story high coal bunker. And the only way they could get rid of the coal that they were emptying out of the bunker was to feed it into the boilers, which made the ship go much faster in a very dangerous part of the ocean when it should have been slowed down or maybe even stopped. So this author, whose name is Sinan Malloy, contends that the fire had much more to do with the ultimate sinking of the Titanic than is credited. The fire weakened the bulkhead because heat makes steel much more, it weakens it. And the fact they were feeding the coal into the boilers, making the ship go faster, also contributed to the disaster. This is a fascinating aspect of the tragedy that I was not aware of at all. And I would like to do a upcoming attractions shout out to the new Emily St. John Mandel book. I was a fan of The Glass Hotel without being over the moon about it. I don't like books that involve children to any great extent, and I don't really like time travel. And Sea of Tranquility, her new book, involves both, and I absolutely loved it. That's all.
Thank you so much, Alden. That was fantastic. As those of you who have heard him recommend books before, you know he's a big fan of the Titanic and knows all the things about it. So I'm glad that you've got another Titanic book in there. So thank you so much, Alden. We really appreciate it. Up next is a children's bookseller from our Manchester location, Nadia Tiktinsky. Nadia, what books do you recommend to us?
Hi, I normally try to be very diplomatic about these, and I try to pick books from a lot of different genres and for a lot of different interests, and I'm going to be a little bit more selfish tonight. We're coming to the end of the year, and what I want to do tonight is talk about just the best books I've read this year, my personal favorites, just from a craft perspective, the things I think are really, really exceptionally well written and that I love to talk about. Because I, as a reader, really love historical fiction and books that are very sad or very intense or about kind of troubled topics. These certainly tend towards those things, but they're just all really exceptionally written. And like David said, I am a children's bookseller at Northshire. I predominantly read children's lit. These are all children's lit books. I'm going to start with my one YA pick to get it out of the way. This is A Sitting in St. James by Rita Williams Garcia. She is best known for One Crazy Summer, which won basically every award the year it came out, which is her other historical fiction. She keeps saying she's not a writer of historical fiction and she's not going to keep doing it, but she keeps writing these amazing historical fiction books. YA, for those who don't know, is young adult literature, teenagers 13 and up, because this book is quite intense and gets quite graphic in a few scenes. I would say this is more 16 and up, certainly for a brave reader, a reader who is willing to be challenged. Sitting in St. James is historical fiction in the 1860s in America. Specifically takes place on a Louisiana plantation in that summer of 1860 when Lincoln was campaigning for president but had not yet become president. This is a tough book to talk about because it is so complex and it is so layered. It's got an enormous cast of characters. It's told in an omniscient third-person voice that dips into a close third for almost every single character in the book. Almost every character has a point of view. The plot basically is Madame Sylvie de Goubert, who is in her late 80s, is the mistress of the plantation, and she decides she wants to commission a portrait of herself to commemorate what she perceives as her successes and her accomplishments throughout her life. And that sets off a chain of events among all of the people living on the plantation. So that's Madame Sylvie and her children and grandchildren and guests staying on the plantation and many, many people that Madame Sylvie and her family members enslave. So all of those voices come together, they come apart, there's a lot going on. At its core, the book is really about these themes of identity and control. Every character seems to be grappling with what they perceive to be their identity versus the identity placed on them by this very restrictive, very rule-oriented Louisiana society in which there are all these complex political relations between white people, enslaved people, freed Black people, Creole people, everybody. Dominant voices in this book, in addition to Madame Sylvie herself, are Thisbe, who's a woman enslaved by the Gilberts who is working as a personal attendant to Madame Sylvie. Thisbe is named after Marie Antoinette's dog. She's been named by Madame Sylvie, and she is living a really excruciating life, both physically and emotionally. She's been forbidden from speaking completely by her enslaver, but she has this incredibly complex personal life. I love her as a character. Another dominant voice is Byron, Madame Sylvie's grandson, who is a West Point cadet home for the summer and is in what at the time had to be a very secretive gay relationship with another cadet who visits the plantation. He is engaged to a woman who lives at a plantation nearby. He is set to be the heir to his family's plantation, but only if he essentially gives up everything about himself and adopts this false life. Really, really, really well written, meticulously researched. Would recommend this to anybody, not just a teenager. And now for some middle grade. Everything else I've picked is a middle grade book. These are for readers age 8 to 12. Think like Harry Potter-ish age range. So there's, always some wiggle room. So I want to start with The Shape of Thunder by Jasmine Warga. She's famous for Other Words for Home, which is her debut, which is beautiful, which is a novel in verse. This one's not a novel in verse. It's a traditional novel, and it plays with pacing in a way that's really, really interesting to me. So before the book has started, this book is about two best friends, Cora and Quinn. They've lived next door to each other their entire lives. They've always been very close friends. But at the start of the book, they haven't spoken for a year. And that's because a year ago, before the book started, there was a school shooting in their town. They both had an older sibling who died. Cora's brother was the shooter, Cora's sister was one of the victims who died, and Quinn's older brother was the shooter. And Cora's family is half Muslim, and it's believed that Quinn's brother, the shooter, that was part of his motivation, perhaps. So it's interesting because that's the emotional climax, right? The emotional climax is this terrible shooting and these two friends whose relationship has been ruined and who have suffered these incredible losses. And the pacing of the book works so that we get the payout of that at the end. The plot is Quinn feels really, really guilty for what her brother has done. And she decides that the way to fix it is she and Cora have to build a time machine so they can go back in time and stop this from happening. And we as adult readers maybe wouldn't go along with that, but it works really well in children's literature because you really never know when you're going to kind of burst into fantasy or burst into sci-fi in children's lit. So the whole book, we're kind of waiting for this maybe to work and for them maybe to get to go back in time and fix it, even though the whole time the fact is that it has happened. I feel okay giving a spoiler on this one because I don't see any kids in the Zoom room. But we get that emotional payout when that plan to build a time machine doesn't work. So it's kind of this emotional pressure cooker throughout the book that explodes at just the right moment. Really well done. Next one I want to talk about plays with form in an interesting way. This is Kaleidoscope, the newest Brian Selznick. This book is like, it's just like a perfect little collection of jewels. It's a collection of connected short stories, but they're so brief that they almost feel like flash fiction for children. So it's a easy read on a like reading level standpoint, but very high level in a concept and craft standpoint. So these stories are all a couple pages long. They all deal with the same two characters in kind of a kaleidoscope of different settings that their relationship could take place. One character is always named James, the other is always an unnamed narrator. Sometimes they're both children, sometimes they're both adults, sometimes one of them is dead, sometimes they are strangers meeting each other for the first time, sometimes they're siblings or best friends, sometimes one of them is inhuman, sometimes it's their relationship is taking place in outer space or far back in time. So it's all of these kind of different versions of what the relationship between these two imagined characters could be. There's repeating imagery throughout these stories. There's a lot of keys and butterflies and walled gardens. So everything is kind of shifting. And if you know Brian Selznick, you know he story tells through pictures as much as he does through words. And so each story begins first with a true kaleidoscope illustration, then with this kind of simplified, straight on image of what was put through the kaleidoscope, and then the story paired with it. Really innovative, really interesting, makes a great gift. And then I want to talk about this one after Kaleidoscope because it's definitely a bit Brian Selznick inspired in the way its story tells through illustration. This is Never Forgotten by Alejandra Algorta, translated by Aida Salazar. And this is a bilingual book. So in the same edition, we have one side in English, the other in Spanish. This was originally published in Colombia, I believe, and now is here. Really, really cool. Again, playing with form, playing with image. This book is about Fabio, who has forgotten how to ride a bike. This is something that all the adults in his life have always told him is impossible. Your body memory prevents you from being able to forget how to ride a bike, but it's happened to him anyway, even though everybody has been telling him it's impossible. Because he can no longer ride a bike, he can no longer go deliver bread for his mother, who's a baker. So he starts spending his time with his elderly next door neighbor who hasn't left her house in years. And she begins to tally for him the many, many lies and few truths of her life. And he's kind of reassessing this world that has been explained to him by adults and what they are telling him the truth about and what they're lying to him about, and kind of looking at the world through his own eyes for the first time. And I wanted to talk about this one after the Brian Selznick one. This doesn't have images interspersed throughout, but at the beginning and end of the book are bracketed by these illustrations, where the first few pages of the book are told through illustration. This is not just an illustration adding to the story. The first 15 pages of the book and the last 15 pages of the book, the plot, the action is told through the illustration, which I think really adds to this murky effect of we don't really know and we can't really tell, even maybe we can't tell what this book is telling us is the truth. We have to look at it for ourselves. We can't just take in the words. Really cool one. Next one I want to talk about is the one piece of speculative fiction I have on my list. I'm not a big fantasy reader, not a big sci-fi reader, but this one I love. It's also historical fiction, speculative historical fiction, set in Pittsburgh in the 1920s. Ophi and her mother move to Pittsburgh. They get work at a manor house. Ophi has the ability to see ghosts. She knows from other people who can see ghosts that you should never approach them, never talk to them. Ghosts are shells of their former beings and can't be trusted. They will instinctually try to sap the life out of any humans they come in contact with. Because this manor house is so old, there are of course people who have died there, and she does see ghosts there. And she can't help herself from talking to this one ghost in particular, who's a young woman who has blood permanently streaming from her neck. She's very elegant. This woman doesn't remember how she died exactly, but she thinks it was something bad happened to her in the house. She feels something was done to her. And she and Ophi are kind of working together, trying to unravel this mystery as Ophi works in the house for this kind of horrible, horrific, racist lady who runs it. She's working as her personal servant. What's really, really interesting about this book to me are two things. One, that it's bringing the Jim Crow South and the racist North into discourse. That doesn't happen a lot, I don't think, in historical fiction in general, certainly not in middle grade children's books, to kind of put those two against each other. Ophi's moving from the South to Pittsburgh. It also talks about passing and colorism, which isn't done a lot in middle grade. And the last thing that I love about this book is the way it's written. It's mostly from Ophi's perspective, but kind of sprinkled throughout the book are these chapters where a place will take on a point of view. So we get a chapter for the train Ophi and her mother take to Pittsburgh. We get a chapter for the manor house. And those are really effective to me in a historical fiction book, because we're not just seeing Ophi's story, we're seeing these places she's moving through, thinking about her, thinking about how her story connects to the greater history. One. And then last one I'm going to talk about, because I think I'm about out of time, is Trowbridge Road. I'm actually a year late to this one. All those others came out this year. This is a 2019 book. It was a National Book Award longlist book last year. Really exceptional. A hard book to sell, but a really good book to read. So trust me on this one. This is also historical fiction. It's set in 1983, which I know a lot of people in this room will be like, that's not historical fiction, but stick with me. This book is set specifically at the very beginning of the AIDS crisis. So that 1983 date is important to the book. The main character here, her father dies of AIDS before the book begins, at a time where nobody knew how AIDS was transmitted. They didn't know what caused it. And so the girl's father died in the house over a prolonged period of time. And for that entire period of time, her mother was caring for him. And the girl, whose name, of course, I'm forgetting, it's June, was not at all allowed to go near him, touch him, be in the same room as him, see him, anything. So it's obviously a really traumatic event. And ever since his death, her mother has been in a period of intense anxiety and depression, and she's essentially become a hypochondriac. She's very, very concerned about germs. She is to the point where she is abusing her daughter. She refuses to touch food that feels frightening to her, so she's not preparing any food for June, who is 9 years old. She's forcing June to take baths in bleach and scrubbing her skin with steel wool. Stick with me. This is a middle grade book. Everything here sounds intense, but it is written for this audience in mind, so it's not as intense in reading as it may seem in me telling it. June starts escaping from her house and spending time with a boy who's just moved in down the street, who's also got a really troubled family life. And they play together and they kind of create this imaginary other world that they can go to escape, which this book feels to me a bit like a modern Bridge to Terabithia, like Stakes Ray's Bridge to Terabithia, where the world is so unbearable that the kids have to escape from it mentally. And they do so in this really creative, joyful way. So that does help kind of keep the reader safe during the book and alleviate the hard things that June is going through. I think that's my time tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Those sound really powerful books. I really appreciate it. Next up, we've got Mike Hare from our Saratoga Springs location. I was talking with Alden earlier about how many books Mike reads. We aspire to be able to get to what Mike can do. All right, Mike, tell us about what you've been reading.
All right, David, thank you very much. And I've got some I'd love to share with you this evening. The first one I have is called Tales from the Cafe, and the author is Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I believe I'm pronouncing that name correctly, Japanese author. And it's a sequel to a book that came out about a year ago called Before the Coffee Gets Cold. The same author. You see the books are very similar in style and how they look. And they're both, they're essentially novels, but they're also sort of a collection of short stories and what happens in the cafe. Both books are set in a cafe, and this cafe is set on a side street, a nondescript side street in the middle of Tokyo. And it's a very small place. You go down the steps and there's about 9 chairs in the cafe. One of the chairs has a little table in front of it. Only one person can sit there. And what makes this chair special is that you can go back in time when you're sitting in this particular chair. So this is a sci-fi book. But it actually deals with very realistic circumstances. Now, you just talked about Shape of Thunder, about the attempt to have a time machine in that particular text. But here the time machine works, but it's a very specific sort of a place to go because there are restrictions on the time machine sitting in this chair. You have to go to a specific place in time in that particular cafe. So if you want to go back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you don't go wherever you want. You have to be in that chair in the cafe. When you stand up, if you stand up, then you're forced back into the present time. But the key rule about this is you need to make your visit to the past and finish it before the coffee gets cold. So someone from the cafe pours you the coffee, you drink the coffee, you go back in time, and you're there only until the coffee gets cold. So you have to make sure you finish it before it gets cold. If not, then bad things happen, which we won't talk about. Unfortunately, bad things didn't happen in these 2 books. But what happens in the book, to me, which is very moving, is that when you go back in time, you can't necessarily change what's happening in the present time. However, you can make decisions or deal with people or circumstances or events that perhaps you wish you dealt with in a different manner when you were in that particular place in time. So it's a very inventive story. And the cafe people, the man that runs the cafe, his daughter is a waitress. The staff is sort of the same in both stories. And if you read one of the stories, they both have 4 stories within them. So again, it's a mixture between a novella, in a sense, also short stories, but it's also essentially a novel because the stories are interrelated, and you have characters in the background from one story that take a leading role in the next story, then they recede to the background again. So both of these books I would highly recommend, and this is the new one again, Tales from the Cafe, and the author is Toshikawa Kawaguchi. I believe I say that right. And it's again, it's in the science fiction section, but it has the basic parameters and style and content of traditional literature. The next book is a history book, American history, and it's called The Cause, and the author is Joseph J. Ellis. And people that read American history would be familiar with this author. He's won the Pulitzer Prize. He's written about a dozen books, many of them focused on the Revolutionary War, and that's what The Cause focuses on too. It deals specifically with the year 1773 to 1783. 1773, a little bit before the war began, after the Boston Tea Party, but before Lexington and Concord, and certainly before the Declaration of Independence. And it ends in 1783, which is just after Yorktown and the treaty being signed to end the Revolutionary War. And it's called The Cause because when the book, Alice says in the book that the Patriots were not necessarily considering themselves revolutionists, even though they were fighting for a cause. The cause was to break free from Great Britain. And what Ellis does very effectively in this book is the interplay between the loyalists and the patriots in the colonies at that time, and also those folks that were kind of in the middle. There's always people in the middle that don't take sides either way, and they kind of go with the flow. And he's also very precise in talking about the interplay in Great Britain and England between Parliament and the warring sides in Parliament about what to do about the colonies. Should they be strict or should they be more lenient? And also King George. So you have all of these different vectors going in different directions in terms of what was happening sort of politically in terms of negotiations, and of course during the fighting itself. George Washington is, as you I'm sure would imagine, one of the leading characters in the book, and Ellis portrays him as a somewhat vain, and somewhat self-important, somewhat pompous individual, but also someone who had a very, very strong moral fiber, who knew right from wrong. He was not, say, like Sam Adams and a real firebrand. He was not intellectually Thomas Jefferson, but Thomas Jefferson was sort of removed from day-to-day sort of decision-making that Washington had to face. And Washington also, of course, had to face serious, serious problems in terms of morale, in terms of lack of money, in terms of actually fighting the war with a bunch of woodsmen against the greatest army in the world, the British. And the French interplay is related to as well. There are many books now about the Revolutionary War that have come out in the last few months, really, and it's a good selection, but this is one that I would highly recommend, The Cause by Joseph J. Ellis, again, dealing with the years 1773 to 1783. The next book is in our parapsychology section in the store, and it's called After, and the author is Bruce Grison. Well, I stress that he is a doctor. He's a medical doctor. He's a psychiatrist. He's the son of a chemist. And the topic of this book is near-death experiences. And near-death experiences, NDEs, and he calls the people who've had the near-death experiences experiencers in the book, have now become fairly well-known and commonplace. You could go on YouTube, you could go to a blog, you could go online and find all kinds of accounts about near-death experiences. But 40 years ago, when Grison began to investigate near-death experiences, they were not well-known. In fact, people who would relate something like this would be looked at as someone maybe that could not be trusted, because everything was sort of nothing was publicized the way that it is today, and there was not that much openness about it because it seemed so strange what happened. And what's interesting about this book, and there are many books with this topic that you can find in Northshire and other sources as well, what is unique about After is that Grison is approaching this not from a spiritual perspective, not from a religious perspective, but from a clinical medical perspective. One of the questions that he asks in the book is, can the brain, after it has stopped functioning, can the mind work independently of the brain? He gets into those sorts of questions about the book. He doesn't use the term soul. He doesn't use the term spirit. He's talking kind of about the same thing, and it's just a matter of semantics to a degree as well. But it's a very interesting take on near-death experiences. And over the years, he has interviewed thousands of folks who have had this experience, or maybe family members and others as well. And he comes to some conclusions that are pretty much across the board. One is that people who have had these experiences benefit from them. They're not afraid of death because of what they've been through for the most part. And also they have a renewed purpose in their life in terms of what they do, what they choose to believe in, how they go about their day-to-day business. And it has a positive effect on them and their relations with other people. It's interesting how he got his start in doing this. He was a young doctor just beginning his practice. And he was in a hospital, and there was a room where a woman was close to death, and he happened to be there now as the treating physician, but he was there in the room, and the woman died. So, he left the room, he went about his business, but when he was gone from the room in that 10 or 15 minutes, they tried to bring the woman back to life, and in fact, they did. The woman was brought back to life, and she was cognizant, she was aware of her surroundings, and she came back to life. And then a few days later, or a day later, Grison went into the room to talk to her, and this woman told Grison where Grison was at that time, what he had, what room he was sitting in. He had a stain on his shirt that this woman who had died somehow knew about, and Grison was essentially flabbergasted by this. How could this woman know these things about me when she was in this room, when she was clinically dead? And then he thought, well, maybe some nurse told her about what he was doing, but she had absolutely no interest in what he was doing. She didn't even know him, but yet she could tell Grison what he was doing, where he was in the 10 or 15 minutes that she was clinically dead. So that is what piqued his interest in what was going on here. Again, this was 40 years ago, and this was not something that was well known. And something else that he comes back to time and again is that he's talked to people that had these experiences 10, 15, 20 years ago, and he'll talk to them 10 years later, and they'll remember it as true to life experience. It's not like a dream. Dreams are sort of amorphous. You dream, you wake up, you kind of remember as the day and the hours go by, you forget what you dreamed. But folks who have had this experience remember that as clearly as any real life event, even more so. So it's a very uplifting book. And again, it's what drew me to it is that it comes from a scientific perspective rather than a quasi-religious or spiritual perspective, even though that's embedded certainly within the experience itself, and it's how you want to approach it as an individual. The next book is in our nature literature section, and it's called On Animals, and the author is Susan Orlean, and I'm sure many of you have read Susan Orlean before. I have not, and I feel bad that I haven't, but this is my first undertaking. She wrote the library book a few years ago, and she was at the store a few years ago too for a signing back when we could do signings in the store. And this is a marvelous book. It's a collection of essays, and the topic, as you can guess, animals. And she talks, these are essays written in the last 10 or 15 years, and she's across the board in what she talks about. There's a nice chicken there on the cover, but there's dogs and cats certainly, but there's oxen, there are mules. There's a difference between mules and donkeys that she gets into. She has a fond affection for turkeys, as it turns out. She writes about many, many animals in the spectrum. And one of the takeaways from the book is that our relationship with animals that she pursues, and she pursues it too, not as an animal rights activist per se. She loves turkeys. She'll probably have turkey for Thanksgiving, a couple days, I don't know. So she's not a vegan or a vegetarian or anything like that. She respects animals, but she's not an animal rights activist in any way. But she talks about the companionability of animals, how they're there, or your pet dog, your cat, your parakeet, your gerbil, your hamster, whatever it is, it's a member of your family. You feel as though you know the animal, but you do, but then there's this degree of being inscrutable, of being sort of in a place that we really can't quite reach, even though we try to. The companionship is there, and of course it depends on the pet, it depends on the pet's personality. We've all had pets. You know, dogs maybe can read easier than cats, I think. I don't know, cats are kind of difficult to get around in terms of what's going in their heads, at least to me. Never mind birds and animals that people have as pets as well. But Susan Orlean in these essays has a wonderful, almost like a wistfulness in terms of how she deals with animals and how she really was able through her work. And some of the essays are about her personal experiences and some are not. Free Willie the Whale, that some of you may remember from a few years ago, that's one of the characters in one of the animals that's listed that she talks about in the book, one of the essays. Also, she talks about a lion tamer or a tiger tamer, actually, with wild tigers that they were actually lions, I'm sorry, that would cuddle up with this person back in Africa back in the 1990s. So you've got personal experiences and other experiences that have not been in part of her life that she has researched, and also through her studies and her research. She's a writer for the New Yorker and has been for 30 years. So she's been in the field working on various and sundry stories. And in that time, she was able to do a lot of write a lot of, certainly see a lot of people throughout the world in Africa and other places where the animals are in the wild, and was able to compile the essays in this particular book called On Animals. So it's a very revealing, happy kind of a book. Next book is not quite as happy. It's called A True History of the United States, and the author is Daniel Surgeon. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is a challenging book. It's about 500 pages, but it reads very, very well. It reads very quickly. And the author is a graduate of West Point. Then he went to serve in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and then he taught at West Point. He's now retired. So in other words, this author is a military man to his bone. He, in fact, you'd see videos and YouTube videos and so forth that he has created, but he was devoted to the military. He went to West Point. He served his country in 2005, 2006, in that time frame, right at the height of the violence in Afghanistan and Iraq. So he was there risking his life every day for his country. So he has the bona fides of someone who is a true patriot. But the book itself, I'll just read the subtitle, and it's called Genocide, Racialized Slavery, Hyper-Capitalism, Imperialism, and Other Overlooked Aspects of American Exceptionalism. So you can kind of tell by that subtitle that this is not a rosy picture of United States history, and in fact it's not. It's a very realistic portrait of US history. It begins with Jamestown, it goes all the way through Trump. It came out early in the year after, I believe the book was written before the election situation that happened about a year ago, but he takes various and sundry aspects of American history in 37 chapters, which was his syllabus when he taught this course at West Point. The book basically stemmed from the course that he taught at West Point to young cadets. The young cadets would be doing the same thing he would be doing. They'd be going, fighting, let's hope not in horribly dangerous situations as he did, but they were being taught at West Point to become soldiers, and he was teaching them that maybe at times what America's decisions have not been perhaps best for the country or best for the world. And it's a very readable book. He's an excellent writer. He's a very lucid writer. He's very clear, and the chapters go very, very quickly. Some of the chapters are more obvious than others. Of course, there's quite a bit about World War II. There's a lot about any wars the United States was involved in, Jim Crow, but he also talks about Clinton, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush are highlighted in recent history. He goes back to the antebellum era, the slavery issues, and he talks about some of the threads of American history that are not perhaps exposed the way that he believes they should be. And of course, there's a lot of talk today nationally and politically about what should be taught in school. Should kids be taught things that are listed in this book that he reveals in this book? Is this appropriate for young people? He also says it's appropriate for adults. What should we be reading? What should we be exposed to in terms of American history? And of course, there are other versions too, and it's not all bad either. There's certainly some in this book. He also talks about many of the positive aspects of American history as well, but it's a very revealing book about some questionable and disturbing aspects of the history of the United States. And my last book goes back to literature, and I've never read this author either, Lily King, who wrote Writers and Lovers about a year or so ago, which is highly acclaimed, a novel. And this is a selection of short stories. And Lily King is a young author. She's written 3 or 4 books, and the short story collection just came out. I just read this last week, and I just love the book. It's very, very well written, about 15 or 20 page stories, about a dozen in the book. And what she does frequently in the book is she talks, the narrators are first person narrators. Some are gay, some are straight, some are men, some are women, but they're all believable. And they're talking when they're in their 40s, which I assume might be about her age, about things that had happened to them when they were younger, when they were teenagers, when they were 20, things that had a very strong impact on their lives and how it affects them to this day. And the first person narratives are very believable. And what struck me, I think it's very important to kind of point this out. You've got the first narrator say is a straight man, and you're reading the story. Then the second one might be a gay woman. However, she's not focusing on the identity of the person so much as the person's basic humanity. So it's not coming from the standpoint of, I'm a gay man and this happened to me. She's focusing on the point that this has happened to me. It could happen to anybody, whether you're gay, straight, male, or female. So that distinction, I think, is important today, because some books kind of go the other way and this one doesn't, which I found very refreshing, because the stories are so believable. In fact, sometimes you're a few pages in and you're brought into the story. They're very wonderfully written, and they draw you in instantly. And you don't even know right off the bat, is this person gay? Is this person straight? Is this a man? Is this a woman? But you don't care because the story is so good. And then all of a sudden you find out, okay, this is who the person is, and you follow it through. And there are other stories that are not written in the first person that are believable as well, especially the very last story in the book. It's just a magnificent story about a writer trying to find inspiration. It's called The Man at the Door, which is just a wonderful story, but it's called 5 Tuesdays in Winter. And the author is Lily King, and that is all that I have. Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much. I know I want to read A True History of the United States now. I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much. This has been a lovely evening. We are going to do another Bookseller Book Chat in December. And I think Rachel and I are probably going to be recommending our own titles for a change. So that'll be fun. And then also of note, we are offering Bookseller Office Hours, which is a seasonal event for the holidays in which Rachel and I come on, and we offer personalized recommendations. It's sort of a low sort of low activity kind of thing. Y'all can come in at any time and register, and then ask us about you're looking for a book for an 8-year-old, or a book for a history reader. So we'd be happy to offer those. We'll be there. And so you're welcome to sign up for any one of those Bookseller Office Hours, and we can try to help you with it.
And you can see all of tonight's recommended books on the blog post that we've posted in the chat a couple of times, and that was in your confirmation email. And you can order them at northshire.com, and hopefully we will see you at another virtual event sometime soon. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.